Good morning from Evinger's Reading Nook, where we are reading Pride and Prejudice on our e-learning days. And I am still grateful for my coffee. So please excuse me when I need a little sip of my coffee to keep me going. But we're going to start chapter 11 of Pride and Prejudice. If you're following along in the novel, as my students, we're on page 43. Remember that you always have access to this story on Project Gutenberg. So if you Google Project Gutenberg, it'll take you. I think it's projectgutenberg.org, and you can search for Pride and Prejudice and have access to the text online for free there as well. So chapter 11, page 43. When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister and, seeing her well guarded from cold, attended her into the drawing room, where she was welcomed by her two friends with many professions of pleasure. And Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentlemen appeared. Their powers of conversation were considerable. They could describe an entertainment with accuracy, relate an anecdote with humor, and laugh at their acquaintance with spirit. But when the gentlemen entered, Jane was no longer the first object. Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned toward Darcy, and she had something to say to him before he had advanced many steps. He addressed himself directly to Miss Bennet with a polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow and said he was very glad, but diffuseness and warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. He was full of joy and attention. The first half hour was spent in piling up the fire, lest she should suffer from the change of room, and she removed at his desire to the other side of the fireplace, that she might be farther from the door. He then sat down by her and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth, at work in the opposite corner, saw it all with great delight. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card table, but in vain. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found even his open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had therefore nothing to do but to stretch himself on one of the sofas and go to sleep. Darcy took up a book. Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bracelets and rings, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library." No one made any reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes round the room in quest of some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you, before you determine on it, to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there are not some among us to whom a ball would be rather a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed if he chooses before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing. And as soon as Nicholas has made white soup enough, I shall send round my cards." "I should like balls infinitely better," she replied, "if they were carried on in a different manner. But there is something insufferably tedious in the usual process of such a meeting. It would surely be much more rational if conversation instead of dancing made the order of the day." "Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I dare say. but it would not be near so much like a ball. Miss Bingley made no answer, and soon afterwards got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom all was aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one effort more, and turning to Elizabeth, said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude." Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up. He was as much awake to the novelty of attention in that quarter as Elizabeth herself could be, and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, with either of which motives his joining them would interfere. What could he mean? She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could at all understand him. "Not at all," was her answer. "But depend upon it, he means to be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy in anything, and persevered, therefore, in requiring an explanation of his two motives. "I have not the smallest objection to explaining them," said he, as soon as she allowed him to speak. "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. If the first, I should be completely in your way, and if the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire." "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley. "I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "Nothing so easy if you have but the inclination," said Elizabeth. "We can all plague and punish one another, tease him, laugh at him. Intimate as you are, you must know how it is to be done." "But upon my honor, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Tease calmness of temper and presence of mind? No, no, I feel he may defy us there. And as to laughter, we will not expose ourselves, if you please, by attempting to laugh without a subject. Mr. Darcy may hug himself." "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," cried Elizabeth. "That is an uncommon advantage, and uncommon I hope it will continue. For it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintance. I dearly love a laugh." "Miss Bingley," said he, "has given me credit for more than can be. The wisest and the best of men, nay, the wisest and best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke." "Certainly," replied Elizabeth, "there are such people, but I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise or good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But these, I suppose, are precisely what you are without." "Perhaps that is not possible for anyone, but it has been the study of my life to avoid those weaknesses which often expose a strong understanding to ridicule, such as vanity and pride." "Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride, where there is real superiority of mind, pride will be always under good regulation." Elizabeth turned away to hide her smile. "Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume," said Miss Bingley. "And pray, what is the result?" "I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. He owns it himself without disguise." "No," said Darcy, "I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding, certainly too little for the conveniences of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others as soon as I ought, nor their offenses against myself. My feelings are not puffed about with every attempt to move them. My temper would perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. The problems of automatic lights. I'm going to keep reading. That is a failing indeed, cried Elizabeth. Implacable resentment is a shade in a character. But you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me. There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect is a propensity to hate everybody. And yours, he replied with a smile, is willfully to misunderstand them. Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, tired of a conversation in which she had no share. Louisa, you will not mind my waking Mr. Hurst? Her sister made not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened, and Darcy, after a few moments' recollection, was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. So let's chat for a minute about what has happened in this book, okay? So we have Elizabeth Bennet, who is our protagonist. She's our main character. And her older sister, Jane Bennet, has won the affection of Mr. Bingley, who is the rich young man who moved into the neighborhood. And we know from the author, from Jane Austen, that Elizabeth's mother is someone that is a laughingstock. Like she's someone everybody makes fun of because she is so impertinent with her desire to move up in society. So she's so focused on moving up in society that she makes a fool of herself, essentially. And Elizabeth and Jane are wonderful young ladies. We've only heard positive things about them, but we know that their younger sisters are not viewed in the same light. They're lacking some social skills when it comes to finer society. Finer society sees through this pretense, and they recognize that they wish they were more than they are. And so they act snobby, even though they have no room to. They're a poor family. There are no boys. So even though they have servants, even though they have money, when Dad dies, when Mr. Bennet dies, the girls are left with nothing, essentially. And so their best hope is to marry well. And that kind of has been the conversation since the beginning. So it's lucky for them that Jane has won the affection of Mr. Bingley. And now we know that Mrs. Bennet instructed her daughter to go to Netherfield, where Mr. Bingley lives, upon invitation, on horseback, hoping that she would have to stay overnight because of the rain. And Jane got very sick and had to stay longer. And because Jane was sick, she reached out to her sister Elizabeth, who joined her. So the last few chapters, Elizabeth and Jane have been at Netherfield with the Bingley family while Jane recovers. And this is the first time Jane has entered the presence of everybody since she's recovered. She's feeling better enough to join them in the evening time. And so Mr. Bingley's affection is focused on Jane. And Elizabeth is happy for her sister. She sees how much her sister loves Mr. Bingley and adores him, and she's glad that attention and that feeling is mutual. Now, remember earlier in the book, Charlotte Lucas gave Elizabeth some advice. She said that Jane needed to be a little more forward with her feelings, that because of Jane's temperament, she doesn't come across as someone who seems interested in Bingley. And Elizabeth is like, how could you say that? It's obvious that she loves Mr. Bingley. But that's because Elizabeth's her sister. She can see that. So Charlotte warns her friend and says she needs to make sure that he knows she's interested. So Mr. Bingley and Jane are engaged in a conversation by the fire in this chapter. And I love the playfulness here between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. So it's obvious that Mr. Darcy likes Elizabeth. And we know that affection first started because he was enraptured by her eyes. Said she has these dark, beautiful eyes. And so he keeps finding himself enraptured by her, right? But we also know from the narrator that Miss Bingley likes Mr. Darcy. So you have this single sister of Mr. Bingley who's in love with her brother's friend, Mr. Darcy, right? And she is just hungry for his attention in this chapter more than any chapter. So I love that Mr. Darcy's reading books and Miss Bingley is trying to get his attention by reading books too. And so it's they didn't say what book they were reading, but we know it's a volume. So I'm thinking like, okay, let's compare it to Harry Potter because you guys know I love Harry Potter. So we have, let's just say Mr. Darcy is reading the first book of Harry Potter, right? Sorcerer's Stone. And Miss Bingley comes up and she's like, oh, he's reading. I'm going to read too. And I'm going to get his attention by reading the second book. Is she going to even know what's going on in the second volume? No, because it's obvious she doesn't read. So she hasn't read the first one. And so she gets bored easily. And she says this line that I actually love. I declare after all, there's no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a good book. And that's how I feel about every good book. If you're one of my students, you've heard me talk about staying up too late reading books sometimes. Pride and Prejudice being one of them. So Miss Bingley's trying to get his attention and it's not working. So the way she finally gets Miss Bingley's trying to get Mr. Darcy's attention. So the way she finally gets Mr. Darcy's attention is she invites Elizabeth to walk around the room with her, right? And Elizabeth was like, sure. So they are walking back and forth around the room. And Miss Bingley's object, Mr. Darcy, whose attention she's trying to get, is finally achieved. He looks up. And so when she invites him, he becomes a little flirtatious. He's like, I'm not going to, because number one, either you guys are walking together because you're sharing secrets. And if I join you, totally defeats the purpose. So that's one reason you guys might be walking around, and I'm not going to do that. If you're not sharing secrets with each other, you're walking around and inviting me to look at you because you know you'll look good when you walk around. And I can appreciate your figures much better if I stay seated instead of walking with you. I can view you from a distance. And so then what happens in this is Elizabeth engages with Mr. Darcy and they kind of have this flirtatious conversation back and forth. And Miss Bingley gets upset because he's not flirting with her. He's flirting with Elizabeth, right? So she's like, forget this. Let's start some music. I just love the way the characters interact in this. And Mr. Darcy does admit his fault to Elizabeth and Miss Bingley. And he says, how does he word it? I cannot forget the follies and vices of others as soon as I ought, nor their offenses against me. My good opinion once lost is lost forever. So he's basically saying that once you lose my opinion, you can't earn it back. So Elizabeth says he's chosen well. But I hope that this is giving you some understanding. I know originally, if you're my honor student, I told you to read 100 pages by today and gave you a couple weeks. And I'll be honest, with the craziness of the world right now, I personally haven't gotten to read those on YouTube like I had intended. So I'm going to keep reading. There's not a test or anything that you need to be prepared for. And I do want to have an online discussion at some point. Probably, well, I guess we're not doing e-learning after spring break. When we get back, I want to have a discussion about this with all of you and just see what your thoughts are on the development. But I'm going to keep reading through spring break. You know that I am an extrovert. You know that self isolation and social distancing is not something I'm good at right now in the quarantine. And so I find my comfort in reading And I'm really excited that we decided to read this over spring break and not wait until after spring break. So I'll continue reading this to you and offering some questions. If you guys join live and you have questions about a certain chapter, please ask them. I know my chat is really quiet right now. My chat on Instagram seems to blow up a little more. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email them to me or ask them specific questions, and I'll try to address them as I'm reading. I do want to offer some instruction in this time of e-learning and virtual learning. So stay tuned. I'll keep reading this morning since I have a great internet connection. So chapter 12 is really short. I'll probably read chapter 12, chapter 13, and chapter 14 all together next here in a little bit after I check my email. Happy Wednesday.